afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world, where you're joining us from. We're really excited to be hosting this webinar, which is the first to share emerging outputs from the E-Cubed Research Fund. My name is Sonja Anderson, and I help coordinate INEE's work around EIE data and evidence, and I have the pleasure of supporting the E-Cubed Research Fund. And so I'm going to not take up any more time and directly hand it over to our presenters. But first, I would like to introduce Nadeen Alalami, who is my fantastic counterpart at Dubai Cares. Nadeen is a research officer at Dubai Cares, managing a diverse portfolio of research and advocacy programs with a focus on education and emergencies. Nadeen manages the E-Cubed Research Envelope, a USD 10 million research fund, which aims to strengthen the evidence base in EIE by supporting contextually relevant and usable research and disseminating global public goods. So Nadeen will share a short introduction and framing from Dubai Cares, and then we will hear from Francine and Zeena around emerging research from the E-Cubed Research Fund, specifically on partnerships in education and emergencies. Thank you so much, and over to you, Nadeen.
Thank you so much, Sonja. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today as we share the final research outputs and findings from this E-Cubed research project titled Promising Partnership Models for Education in Emergencies. Today's session represents the culmination of a 3-year research project examining the nature and impact of partnerships at the global and local levels in education and emergencies, with a specific focus on education for Syria refugees. This is a project that has persevered through multiple global and local challenges and has now generated incredibly relevant evidence informing partnership practice in education and emergencies. The research program has generated a set of guiding principles and promising partnership models for both current and future partnerships in EIE. These guiding principles are highly relevant since, despite a surge in educational partnerships in the last few years, the EIE community has yet to develop guiding principles on how organizations might approach partnerships so that they result in effective and ethical practices, leading to improvements for learners in crisis settings. These principles do not merely provide guidance, but as you will see in today's presentation, they demand a shift in orientation away from traditional or more commonplace thinking and action in education and emergencies. Now, before we go into the presentation, I will take just a little bit of time to share the story of E-Cubed and our progress so far. So as Sonja mentioned, the E-Cubed Research Envelope is a $10 million fund that was developed by Dubai Cares together with INEE back in 2017. Through annual calls for proposals, E-Cubed aims to strengthen the evidence base for EIE. And we do this by supporting contextually relevant and action-oriented or usable research that is shared as a global public good. This research envelope was launched in response to a need expressed by the EIE community for more and better evidence in EIE. And it's also building on a commitment that we at Dubai Cares made to allocate a third of our funding towards education in emergencies in order to support children and youth affected by crises, as well as all those who are working to deliver quality education in crisis-affected contexts. At the core of the E-Cubed Research Envelope's formation and its approach is Dubai Cares' partnership with INEE. INEE's network of well over 16,000 members that continues to be diversified makes INEE a true hub for all those engaged in delivering education in emergencies. Together with INEE, we set out to create this research envelope, and we have developed a process for receiving and reviewing research proposals through annual calls for proposals. And now E-Cubed is in its 5th year, and it has grown into a global, rigorous, and highly regarded fund for evidence in EIE, where research priorities and agendas are generated by and for the education and emergencies community. Through E-Cubed, Dubai Cares has funded over 15 research projects across a diverse set of thematics, everything from learning outcomes to social cohesion and education, gender and education, youth, higher education, and educational technology. The research project that we will be talking about today was actually one of the very first awarded projects following the first E-Cubed call for proposals. And the evidence that has been generated from this work has become more and more pertinent as there has been an increase in partnerships for EIE over the past few years. Today's presentation represents one of many efforts that Dubai Cares, together with INEE, will be facilitating in order to contribute towards closing the loop between research, policy, and practice, and in order to support stronger and more effective EIE practices. So with this in mind, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce today's presenters and the project principal investigators, Francine Menashy and Zeena Zakharia. Francine Menashy is Associate Professor in the Department of Educational Studies at Brock University. Her research explores global governance of education, international education policy, and aid to education in development and humanitarian contexts. And Zeena Zakharia is Assistant Professor of the International Education Policy at the University of Maryland, College Park. Her research examines conflict and peace building in education, and it advances a critical approach to refugee studies in the Middle East. So with that, Francine and Zeena, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nadeen, for that introduction. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Before we get started, we'd just like to acknowledge the very sobering time that we're living in, where the world is witnessing a new refugee crisis emerging. Of course, this is in addition to so many crises worldwide resulting in forced displacement. And so against this backdrop, we're sharing highlights from our recently completed research on partnerships in education and emergencies, which we conducted with co-investigator Maha Shuaib of the Center for Lebanese Studies, who unfortunately couldn't join us today. And we share our hope that this work might result in some new understanding of partnerships in education and emergencies that serve young people and their communities on their journeys in displacement. We are so grateful to Dubai Cares and to INEE, Nadeen, Sonja, and for their support of this research and their undying flexibility and understanding as our study faced a number of obstacles along the way, as Nadeen mentioned. And we're also grateful to our research team members, including phenomenal students and researchers from 3 different institutions. Over the past decade, humanitarian organizations have increasingly advocated for partnerships to address the challenges of educational access and provision in contexts of crisis, including conflict, disaster, and other emergencies. An array of global policy actors has embraced intra-agency collaboration in education policymaking, funding, implementation. The impetus to partner derives from broader efforts to enhance coordination between agencies, effectiveness of programming, efficiency in funding mechanisms, and a localization agenda in which affected communities engage in all aspects of education policy and implementation. Through an expansion of partnerships, the education and emergencies sector has come to resemble a wide policy network of actors and organizations working together across global, national, and local scales. This project studied partnerships between organizations in education and emergencies and sought to understand the nature and impact of these partnerships, using the educational response to the Syria refugee crisis in Lebanon as a case study. So we investigated the characteristics of partnerships between organizations, including their activities, their relationships, the different kinds of organizations involved, and how they changed over time. We analyzed specifically the experiences of partners within Lebanon, and we examined the effects of these partnership activities on the education of refugee students. Since 2011, the war in Syria has prompted the mass displacement of 6.7 million people, largely to neighboring countries. Lebanon alone has attempted to absorb over 500,000 school-age Syria refugee children, comprising 1/3 of all children in Lebanon and 45% of public school enrollments. So this refugee crisis was the focus of our study at first, but it represents just one emergency the country has faced in recent years and over the course of our research. In October of 2019, protests broke out throughout the country over new taxes and a lack of government accountability, and this led to school closures for weeks at a time. Over the next 2 years, Lebanon saw a severe political and financial crisis with a devastating deterioration of the economy. The COVID-19 pandemic compounded Lebanon's ongoing crises. Many children had already been out of school in late 2019 because of the protests, and the outbreak of COVID in March of 2020 resulted in countrywide school closures, as with most of the world. These school closures and a shift to virtual learning had a significant impact on refugee students in particular. On August 4th, 2020, a blast described as one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history detonated in Beirut port, killing hundreds. The explosion devastated a 6-mile radius of Beirut, damaging over 300 school buildings. And globally, the study also coincided with the Black Lives Matter protests and a global reckoning on racism. Now, this relates to our study because many of the international organizations working within Lebanon began to reckon with racism within their organizations and in global education more widely. So our study was conducted over a time period that saw all of these multiple crises and events take place within Lebanon and globally. And so we attempted to capture how this multi-crisis environment impacted education partners and operations over time. We should add that our team members within Lebanon experienced these crises acutely themselves and yet managed to keep this study going. We designed this research as a 3-year iterative vertical case study where our qualitative global and country level analyses were tied together by a quantitative network analysis. Now, vertical case study is a methodology that situates local experiences within global phenomenon, including global policies, mandates, processes. So we analyzed global level data from international organizations, global education policy actors, and country level data from within Lebanon, including from locally situated organizations and actors, but analyzed all these data in reference to each other and over time. Data included over 100 interviews with both global and local actors. The global actors were involved in partnerships in education and emergencies and included representatives of international financial institutions, UN agencies, international non-governmental organizations, and donor governments and foundations. We drew from key informant interviews with actors within Lebanon who were involved in refugee education partnerships and who were often the implementers of projects funded by international organizations. These include representatives of non-governmental organizations, religious, charitable organizations, and also school administrators and educators. We analyzed 250 documents. This involved a content analysis, including a coding of themes from international and regional education organizations. And we conducted a social network analysis of 440 different organizations. So this involved creating a data set of all the organizations working within Lebanon on Syria refugee education at 2 separate time points. So first in 2019 and then again in 2021. So we determined links to other organizations or partners, and we created visuals to show these relationships. So from this analysis, we also determined the centrality of organizations within the network. And by centrality, we mean the number of connections each organization has. The more connections, the higher the centrality measure. And we conducted 3 in-depth case studies drawn from a broader examination of 16 partnerships within Lebanon, including over 30 site visits and observations. So each partnership case study included at least one organization headquartered in the global north and one headquartered in Lebanon. In each case, at least one was a non-state organization. And we observed their education activities and interviewed stakeholders, both in person and virtually, over a 3-year span. Our vertical data analysis revealed 3 key overarching thematic findings, which we'd like to share with you. First, our vertical analysis of all data exposed an environmental shift in education and emergencies that reflects increased marketization of the humanitarian response in education and more generally. This shift is evidenced in 2 general ways. First, through increased private sector participation in education and emergency partnerships, where companies in particular have become more engaged. And second, through a more business-like way of working, a business-like approach to education and emergencies in terms of a competitive, outcomes-based, and data-driven environment that focuses on outputs. Global level evidence points to a rise in private sector participation in education and emergencies. So organizational documents frequently point to the need for increased engagement of the private sector as a non-traditional funding source and to spur new innovation in education and emergencies. For instance, UNICEF states it will keep working to strengthen public and private sector partnerships for enhanced results. Interviews with global actors corroborated this rhetoric. Respondents overwhelmingly agreed that the roles of private actors have expanded in the education and emergency space and that they've become key partners, stating that what's new is the engagement of the private sector, and the role of the private sector absolutely has increased over the last few years. Furthermore, the COVID-19 pandemic may have accelerated private sector engagement. For instance, global actors described how some partnerships with private actors were established specifically to respond to the COVID emergency in education, in particular to rapidly develop new ed tech innovations that could enable learning during mass school closures. A donor respondent explained COVID accelerated that step forward into commitment. Particularly, private sector actors couldn't sit by the sidelines and saw an opportunity to really jump in. Another said, I think we've seen that the private sector stepped up in distance learning. I think COVID forced the hand on that. Our database and network analysis lends further evidence to this rise in private participation in education and emergencies, where in a single country, over 100 businesses and foundations of a total of 440 organizations in our database have participated in Syria refugee education over the course of 3 years, increasing by 20% after the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And this visual shows technology-based partnerships in education in emergencies in Lebanon as red lines. You can see the expansion during the pandemic between 2019 and 2021. Now, within Lebanon, several respondents described how they actually had to establish new relationships with businesses to support virtual platforms for out-of-school refugee children. In addition to a rise in private sector participation, respondents spoke more generally and conceptually about the growth and entrenchment of business-like ways of working in the education and emergency space. So for example, respondents noted that the sector has become increasingly competitive, where competition tends to characterize the sector rather than coordination. A respondent explained, everyone is very territorial about what they're doing. Everyone's competing for funding. Another said, it's challenging for folks to share information where they have yet to secure funding to operate. As well, local EIE actors, which have secured funding from larger organizations, such as international organizations or big international non-governmental organizations, describe their work in country as increasingly more output-driven, where quantitative data must be delivered on a strict schedule in order to maintain funding. A local partner described how one of their conditions was to have an external evaluator to accompany us. Another explained, quote, "You have to work in a very tight system." And international organizations' documents further lend evidence to the importance of innovation via this efficient, output-based environment in education and emergencies. For instance, Education Cannot Wait promotes their optimized and results-driven approach and seeks to incentivize partners to deliver results. Critiques of this marketized environment in education and emergencies were revealed through interviews at both the global and local levels. For instance, the participation of business actors was critiqued given the tensions involved in private-oriented mandates compared to humanitarian goals. We were told, the reason is, of course, to get a profit, to return on whatever they do. Another said, quote, "At the end of the day, they want the market." And a respondent described the sector as, quote, "a tug of war." And then another stated how efforts really easily crumble if there isn't the goodwill and trust among partners to coordinate. And then finally, the output-oriented projects, which require steady responsiveness to funders, counters the flexibility needed for participatory practices. A local respondent explained, they also focus a lot on numbers and targets because they have certain targets that they have to meet. So we're pressured to meet their targets. The partnership that was described in this last quote with a large international organization revealed how a local NGO had to abide by particular outcome-based practices, deliver data, very specific data on a timeline, and that the international organization did not communicate in a transparent manner about goals. Our analysis suggested a clear imbalance in this partnership in which the international organization largely drove mandates and practices, and the local NGO had to respond to the international funders' needs. A second overarching theme from our findings centers on the two overlapping concepts of participation and localization. Despite widespread agreement that participation and localization, education and emergency efforts would contribute to the success of partnerships, each level of our analysis exposed the limited nature of both participation and localization. So global level interviews revealed widespread agreement that participation of country level actors or members of affected communities in global partnerships remains very low. When local participants do engage at the global level, they are often tokenized and their voices hold little power. We were told the beneficiaries are rarely in the room, and oftentimes if they're in the room, it can take a very tokenistic, paternalistic lens to it. Some respondents explained that this lack of participation results in poor contextualization of activities. We were told sometimes I feel as if they're dealing with Yemen, as if they're dealing with Denmark. Sometimes they don't understand the context. And sometimes when they put in their strategy, they don't give the space for those of us who are living on the ground to plan or to engage in the planning. Another set of localization. I think the sector preaches about localization, but I haven't seen much action yet. And the network analysis of partnerships within Lebanon also displayed the widespread participation of international actors, including international organizations, bilateral agencies, foundations, and companies headquartered in the global north, which in this visual are represented by dark dots, whereas those headquartered in Lebanon are light dots. Several respondents viewed the COVID-19 pandemic as potentially accelerating localization. Due to border closures and lockdowns, international actors could no longer, what's termed parachuting into countries with EIE programs, therefore reducing their presence and their proximity. And as a result, local partners took the helm and maintained projects during exceptionally challenging moments. A respondent noted how this pandemic has emphasized the organic resilience that exists within communities and reminded us that we, as international NGO workers, we have a limited view into what will work in a given context. Another said the travel, the reasons for the travel, it was frivolous. So I think that will certainly cause a change in the sector. Some organizations have thought differently about their practices, that the pandemic was helping us to put into practice some of this decolonization way of working, to listen to grantees rather than telling grantees what to do. At the same time, though, several actors felt that structural inequities in the global humanitarian architecture would likely hinder localization from taking hold. We were told the bigger underlying causes of inequality and poverty and exploitation are not really addressed through this. We know how to work remotely, but we're not really looking at our bigger kind of global inequities. None of this is really relevantly addressed in our response to the COVID crisis. And a Lebanese actor remarked, I did not really feel a change because, you know, we have so many international NGOs working. We have really big operations in terms of UN agencies. So international staff are really very present in the country. And with COVID and so on, this has not really changed much. I mean, it may have even increased. And our network analysis supports this. The international organizations did increase in number between 2019 and 2021, as did their relationships. Although country partners may have led the response during crises, the overall network structure doesn't suggest the acceleration of localization, but instead the durability of relationships. I'm going to now pass it over to Zeena, who will discuss the third theme.
Thanks, Francine. A third key overarching theme that emerged from the vertical analysis, intersecting with the themes we've already discussed, is that of power asymmetries within EIE partnerships and how some partnerships manage to address power imbalances and create more meaningful partnerships. At the global level, power imbalances appear to be clear and long-standing. Limited participation and localization reflects these power asymmetries, where actors and organizations from the global north, those with resources and other forms of capital, drive policy decision-making, agenda setting, and determining of outcomes. When asked which organizations wield most influence in EIE partnerships, we were told repeatedly, organizations that wield resources are perceived to hold most power. Donors. There's certain donors that are super influential and really throw their weight around. Whoever has money. I'd say primarily donors, because money talks and people who hold the purse strings are able to influence. Despite widespread acknowledgement that the humanitarian sector needs to change to shift power imbalances, according to interview respondents, these inequities persist. As an INGO actor asserted, quote, "The power dynamics in humanitarian response are fraught with problems," unquote. Our network analysis further lent evidence to power asymmetries between organizations. The degree centrality measures show that international organizations hold central positions in the network with more ties than any other group. While international organizations hold more central positions within the network, as highlighted by the yellow bar here, it is also important to recognize that if you look at the numbers of organizations, there are relatively few international organizations overall in the network, and the small number holds a disproportionately large number of connections. For instance, by far, the single most central organization in both phases of data collection was UNICEF. In contrast, local and national NGOs are more numerous but have fewer ties. An organization's location in the network, its centrality, may reflect more opportunities, stronger ties to more actors, and the ability to determine or distort flows of information, and therefore wield influence and power. We acknowledge that determining power based on centrality is suggestive, Yet based on the triangulation of our findings, we posit that most central actors in the network hold influence in the network. We also analyzed ties between the different types of organizations in the network. A heat map of ties between organization types shows that the most numerous ties in the network are between international NGOs and local or national NGOs, followed by ties between international NGOs themselves and between international NGOs and private companies. Our network analysis, in conjunction with our qualitative findings, suggest that power is expressed not only through the wielding of fiscal resources, but also in how relationships are organized, structured, and how they function through partnerships, including who has the power to define and disseminate knowledge, standards, and ways of working. In reflecting on power dynamics between partners, one respondent stated, "In the end, you're not equal. They plan and you execute, and they can stop at any time." The 2020 escalation in the Black Lives Matter movement and growing calls to decolonize global development and humanitarianism led many organizations to acknowledge the need for structural changes to address such power imbalances. Many organizations released statements decrying racism in the sector and signed pledges to initiate change. As a respondent explained, there's been a big internal reckoning. Another recognized how global racism plays out in partnerships, stating, "There is a way that it plays out in the United States, but there's a way that it plays out also in other parts of the world, where very much tied to a decolonization framework. Frankly, for the field of development and for international education, it is long overdue to have this discussion." Yet these power structures for now appear to remain deeply entrenched, where issues of race, as several respondents noted, are, quote, "nowhere even on the agenda," unquote. Given that our research sought to examine promising partnership practices, we intentionally selected as case studies from a wider sample those partnerships that appeared from our initial survey to function in positive ways and with strong outcomes. And interestingly, these partnerships overall did not seem to suffer from overt power imbalances, at least not to the same degree as suggested by other aspects of our data. Although the case studies involved different types of organizations, each prioritized participatory practices and local knowledges, exhibited similar practices, which we'll discuss, and sustained the partnerships and their educational programs across acute crises. For example, all the local organizations in our case studies prioritized participation from local educational and refugee communities, including teachers and families. According to educators, they felt as though they were trusted collaborators on the projects and that international partners respected them. In turn, international actors voiced how much they learned from their local partners and that they trusted local actors, affording them the flexibility to make appropriate decisions through a hands-off approach. As one partner described, "We communicate a lot, we reflect a lot, we discuss a lot of things, as if we're working together in one team somehow, because it's very, very important that the partnership has good communication." A Syrian teacher explained that the partner organization, the partners, they don't patronize us by playing the teacher's role with us. On the contrary. Localization linked to trust, communication, and care appear to sustain partnerships through acute crises. According to partners, and as reflected in the words of a Syrian principal, whenever these factors coexist, you can just keep going. Our findings brought to light the vital work of local actors and how they embraced refugee community participation. We posit that when partners valued mutual learning, including local knowledges and expertise, partnership activities were sustained through crises and in turn supported student retention in virtual school and their attendance in classes. An example of the knowledges that sustained learning were highlighted during the COVID-19 pandemic. The country-level data exposed the resilience and creativity of local stakeholders and refugees, especially teachers and students. The pivot to virtual learning, while challenging and not without problems, was done quickly and flexibly, with kindness and humor. Here are just some examples of our virtual observations. There are screenshots of lessons created and held via WhatsApp. In the last image, you can see the students laughing at a voice comment made by the teacher. And from one of our observations, on the last day of a science class, the teacher greeted the students and the students greeted the teacher back. And one student texted, "Bye, mister, we're gonna miss you. I don't know how I'm going to spend my summer without sciences." Our vertical analysis points to the potential for significant power asymmetries, in particular due to structures that promote inequitable participation in EIE activities and decision-making. However, even in the face of these power imbalances, we see the potential for meaningful partnerships. Inequities emerge at all levels, but this may be due to how partners operate and the wider structures in which they work, including organizational cultures and constraints, rather than who they are as people or the types of organizations that they represent. Practices that appear to reduce power asymmetries include self-reflection, openness to change, trust, and respect for partners. Through acknowledging one's own position of power and engaging in efforts to alter power dynamics, we argue that anyone and any organization has the potential to be a good partner. From analyzing all our data vertically, we arrive at 5 key ways in which partnerships in education and emergencies can support and sustain learning for refugees. These we refer to as guiding principles. Through pursuing the 5 guiding principles, meaningful partnerships can result and in turn will better support education for those in crisis settings. First, our findings suggest that the principle of care contributes to positive, productive partnerships in EIE. By care, we refer to the sometimes intangible ways in which partners interact and approach their activities while collaborating with one another as fellow humans, rather than merely fellow humanitarians or education professionals. Second, the related principle of trust and respect together contribute to partnership success in EIE. Respect includes recognition that all partners hold strengths and capacities to conduct their work, and partners must trust one another to carry out their work effectively. Third, our research found that ongoing and organic communication led to stronger partnerships. Through genuine, oftentimes unscheduled communication through various means, be it virtual, over the phone, messaging apps, email, or in person, partners come to better know each other, understand each other's goals and ways of working, and trust one another. Fourth, our study highlighted several partnership activities at global and local levels that demonstrated the ways in which partners effectively share knowledge and learn from one another. This sharing and learning is multidirectional, in particular between different types of organizations which occupy different roles and regardless of resources, size, and location. And finally, our analysis suggests that a first step towards changing power imbalances requires self-reflection, acknowledging who embodies positions of power and why, and how this power relates to wider structures. Interrogating power dynamics can be organized through scheduled activities, but more importantly, it involves sometimes uncomfortable self-reflection on the part of individuals. Each of the 5 guiding principles demands a shift, which suggests the need for more overarching transformation in traditional ways of operating in the humanitarian sector. But although structural change must occur in order to facilitate and make permanent major shifts in humanitarianism, we propose that individuals and organizations can begin to spur such transformation through changing their own practices and beliefs. First, our study suggests a shift from saviorism to care. More traditional or commonplace approaches to education and emergencies often derive from a place of benevolence or charity, While these might be considered positive attitudes, they risk embodying saviorism, where partners who perceive themselves to be in a more privileged position act as though the other partner requires rescuing. Such motivations focus more on those providing aid in a one-directional sense, rather than a focus on local partners as people with struggles, but also agency, knowledge, ingenuity, and capabilities. Second, a shift from a culture of monitoring and outputs to a culture of trust and respect. Our findings suggest that partners ought to trust and respect one another's values and goals, even in the case that they differ. When partners trust and respect one another, their partnerships can avoid an approach that emphasizes efficiency and dictates output-driven projects via constant monitoring of data. The third shift is from a focus on coordination to communication. Coordination, a widely agreed upon factor in effective EIE programming, is touted as a means to achieve efficiency in partnerships and successful outcomes. Yet a focus on coordination aligns primarily with a northern-based discourse. And in considering how partnerships operate, ongoing and organic communication is key. Fourth, a shift is required from capacity building to mutual learning. Although the term capacity building has pervaded the humanitarian sector, our findings suggest that this one-directional and potentially paternalistic concept does not capture how effective partnerships operate. Partnerships that embrace mutual learning occur when those from the global north position themselves as learners too. Finally, a shift from power imbalances to self-reflection through awareness and interrogation. Our vertical analysis at each level and through each set of data revealed that power imbalances pervade partnerships in education and emergencies. Power dynamics reflect structural, systemic, and direct forms of inequities, sometimes economic, often racialized, and colonial. Our study suggests that some partnerships might never achieve true equality. In particular, when resources and funding come into play, inequities might remain entrenched. But meaningful partnerships which result in positive outcomes based on care, trust, respect, and mutual learning can be achieved when everyone involved moves toward awareness of structural power asymmetries. Through applying the 5 partnership principles: care, trust, and respect, ongoing and organic communication, mutual learning, and multi-directional knowledge sharing and self-reflection and interrogation of power dynamics, meaningful and positive partnerships can result, and in turn will better support education in emergencies. Thank you so much for joining us. And if you'd like to learn more about the study and access some of the publications and resources, please visit the project website at eiepartnerships.org. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francine and Zeena. This is my second time hearing the presentation, and I'm equally just engaged and really amazed by the insightful findings from your research. I haven't seen any questions posted in the Q&A or the chat yet. So while folks kind of digest your presentation, I'm going to give you a moment. Please feel free. We hope that you'll post them in the Q&A, but if not, feel free to use the chat function. In the meantime, I am going to share some quick links for Francine and Zeena's work, including the website. But please share any questions or reflections you have. I think Francine and Zeena would be equally interested in hearing any thoughts on their presentation. Francine, Zeena, and Nadeen, anything to add as we're letting people kind of digest and hopefully think about questions?
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Sonja. I think everyone would probably be very excited to see some of those links and learn how they can continue to follow up on your work. And so we will also share a little bit of information about that as we receive more questions.
Perfect. So I do see one question coming in from Nina. How receptive do you think the major donors will be to these insights? And maybe we can just start with that. Hopefully folks will continue adding questions as well.
Should I start? I think that's a great question. My sense is from the interviews that we conducted with major donors is there is a really widespread acknowledgement that current practices really aren't working. And there's an acknowledgement that localization needs to be much more strongly embedded. And I think the question is how to change it within the structures that individuals are working in. I think individual donors will be very receptive of these findings. I really even question if they'd be all that surprised by these findings. I think the one big hurdle will be the output-based environment that funders are working within, because that is so deeply entrenched. That's such an understood, everything must be reported on, everything must be delivered on a timeline. I think that's a very capitalist, neoliberal way of thinking, and that's the way the global economy works. And I think individuals within the organizations will be really receptive to knowing that things have to change. I think it's working within these structures that will be a bigger challenge.
Thank you. And it's great to see these questions coming in. So I'm going to start posing some from the Q&A function as well. So there's a note, can you tell us more about your social network analysis method and any surprising results? And I think that aligns well with another question, which is just wondering whether any of the findings were surprising to you.
We can start with saying something about the network analysis. The first step of it was really collecting this information about, you know, who's actually in the field in Lebanon working on this in this area, and creating this really extensive data set with all the different organizations and who their partners are. And that was a very big project that was done at 2 collection points. And then once we had that and we were able to clean the data, we were able to run comparisons between the two time points. Were there any surprising results in the network analysis? I don't know. I'm not sure what we expected. I'm not sure we expected the network to be so so extensive. We wondered, you know, how centrality might link to ways of working and so on. But I don't know. I'm not sure that there were any big surprises. I think we expected from the interviews that there would be a big shift after COVID-19, the onset of COVID-19, based on some of the conversation that we had with actors at that point. And yet the network remained rather stable. That was probably a surprise to us. We didn't, given how people were talking about localization and you know, the acceleration of localization, we expected that to be mirrored in the network analysis, but it was not. And then in terms of surprises overall, I think Francine and I were quite impressed by how all of the data converged so clearly. We didn't really anticipate that after this extremely complex study with so many parts and so many people involved and so many elements, that it would boil down to these 5 very elementary principles.
Great. I'm going to keep posing questions in the interest of time, if that's okay. It's really exciting to see them coming in. So two that are kind of coupled around Lebanon specifically. One is, do you have data on who are the strong partners in Lebanon for EIE? And the second, a thanks for sharing the findings from Lebanon, and a question, is there a role for the government as partner, assuming they will eventually be responsible for providing education to all?
Zeena, do you want to take this one? I think you'd be better positioned to answer.
Sure. So I'm not exactly sure what is meant by strong partner in Lebanon. You know, we talked about central partners, and actually in our data, we know where every organization, which dot belongs to which organization. We have decided not to reveal who is who in order to protect our participants, because we also show in our report where our participants for the case studies are located in the network to help people understand how central or peripheral they are and the kinds of ways of working. We highlight that in the report, so we don't want to reveal who they are. So strong partner in terms of very central partner, the most central was UNICEF, and that I think is clear to say, but also there were some fairly central other international organizations and government entities. But are they strong partners? I mean, depends what we mean by that. Are they good partners? Are they? So we have a sense from what people told us, but we cannot reveal. We can't really expose our participants in that sense, but perhaps this, you might want to ask something more detailed on that. Is there a role for government as partner? There's always a role for government as partner, and the government, in fact, and different aspects of the government are actually in the network maps that you saw. They were quite connected in phase one to many organizations. And they were also in the second phase, interestingly, had more connections. I guess that was kind of a surprise for me, that after all of the political upheaval, that we should find more connections to government despite massive dissent and revelations about corruption and so on. So I think maybe for me, that was one surprise. Is there a strong and good role for government? Absolutely. The government in general is responsible for ensuring the right to education, and all partnerships should help to elevate and extend this, the capacity in order to do this.
So Zeena, if I could just add to that, to the first question around who are the strong partners. One of our findings, I think that was, it's really important to say, and Zeena said it when she was presenting, is that we found that anyone can be a good partner. And I think there's often this rhetoric around, especially around state versus non-state actors, or private versus public, or even global north, global south. We found, especially through the case studies, that irrespective of what sector you come from, or irrespective of the type of organization, anyone, if they embody these characteristics and abide by certain values and certain principles in their actions, they can be an outstanding partner. So, for example, one of our case studies was between a large foundation north and a smaller NGO, which was very active within Lebanon. But the larger global organization that funded the activities was very hands-off, very flexible, really felt they could learn a lot from the Lebanese organization and had really, really profound outcomes as well. And so I think a strong partner can be anyone. It doesn't matter so much about where your resources are coming from or where you're situated in this big network. It depends on your actions and the principles that you abide by.
Thank you. There's two more kind of groupings of questions that I hope we can get to in the last couple minutes. Thank you so much to everyone for engaging with this presentation. So the first is kind of around shifting those power dynamics. 3 questions. Can you elaborate more regarding the transformational shift from capacity building to mutual learning? I see the added value of mutual learning. However, I also see the added value and importance of capacity building. And another kind of in line, do you have any insights or tips on how INGOs can adapt to have a more equitable approach to partnerships? And finally, what are practical ways that INGOs and international actors can divest power to allow local practitioners to have a more meaningful voice in agenda setting and program implementation? So if you could speak kind of to those three questions as a grouping. Thank you.
So I can start, and Zeena, you can jump in. So it's interesting because we decided to use the term mutual learning as opposed to capacity building or two-directional capacity building, because capacity building is such a common phrasing. It is a narrative that has really pervaded development and humanitarian spaces for decades now. And the connotation and really what it has meant in almost any context has been actors from the global north developing the capacity or building the capacity in those within the global south in affected communities. It has very, very rarely been considered two-directional. And so instead of this idea of one actor building something up and another actor, we decided that it makes more sense to think about learning from one another, which is why mutual learning is something that can take place, and it is more of a horizontal rather than a vertical action. So we made the choice. We could have said two-directional capacity building. That's not actually what we're thinking. We're not really thinking that someone is building something in someone else. It's a process. It's a back and forth. It's fostered through respect for one another's knowledges and views, and fostered through a lot of communication. It's not something so much as I'm going to, it's for those educators out there, it's not a banking model of education. It is a mutual activity. And so that's my response to the first question around capacity building. Although I think it depends on how you define it, but the value is more in the two-directional activity of learning. Zeena, did you want to jump in? I didn't jot down the other questions. Oh, the divesting power. Did you want to jump in now?
So I can't remember the exact question, but it was about divesting power. You know, how can we divest power, and how can we become more equitable in our interactions? The findings of our study suggest that there are several different ways that this can take place. And in fact, embodying these 5 principles and the sort of conceptual shift that we're talking about, these transformational shifts, will in turn lead to more equitable relationships. The participants in our study, you know, we spoke to them over time, and they were consistent in what they considered and used as examples of how these relationships were built, the sort of elements of these relationships, and it included these basic elements that were found across the case studies. In terms of, are there sort of policies or, scripted ways that we can change mechanisms? I think this will vary for every different type of organization. Each organization must look at these principles for themselves and find the locations within their work that these can be better established. We can't really compare a large international organization and propose for it how it might make these changes as compared to, let's say, a religious school that is, a one school organization in partnership with others. They will have different ways that they might need to implement or think about these principles. So it is in working out these principles, and of course, to do that, one must be involved in reflective processes as an organization, and as individuals within those organizations.
Thank you both. I know we're a couple minutes over time. Thank you so much to those of you who are still with us. There are just two questions that I think I'll pose in wrapping up. I think they're helpful in thinking through kind of next steps. And then Zeena and Francine, if you have any final thoughts or reflections that you'd like to add. And then Nadeen, I would hand it over to you for any closing words. So just really briefly, the last two questions are kind of about extrapolating the findings. So I wonder how much of these findings apply outside of the EIE sector. Notes a participant, for example, on the centrality of donors and international organizations in education or development networks. And another seconds this saying, I think that these findings are very important for EIE and also relevant for other sectors. Have you thought about or had any ideas about how this might be meaningfully opened out? So just those two for you to kind of reflect on as you close, and then over to you, Nadeen.
Thanks so much for those last two questions. We've talked about how these findings, we really hope we can somehow disseminate them to, for instance, other humanitarian sectors, because from all of our reading, all of the literature, and reading the news and podcasts, and we feel that the humanitarian sector writ large could really benefit from thinking about these partnership principles. And also, I do think that a lot of the findings cross over to the development sector. Absolutely. And I think that this is we could have a whole other conversation about the overlap, the nexus between development and humanitarianism. But I think a lot of these power imbalances really transcend both and could be shifted with the implementation of some of these principles and learning from this kind of research. And just a final word from me, I'm so happy that you all attended. I hope you got something out of this presentation, and we had to squeeze 3 years of work into about 40 minutes, and there's much more, and we'd be, if you have any further questions, I know we'd both be very happy to hear from you. You can send us an email or take a look at the website. We have a lot more resources there. And I'm just so grateful. And I'm so grateful to Nadeen and Sonja and INEE and Dubai Cares for inviting us to spend this hour or so with you.
I'll add just one thing about extrapolating the findings outside EIE. Yes, we've also talked about how they completely relate to our research partnerships as well. So we've done a lot of reflection over the last 3 years about how there are elements in our research partnership that made it possible for us to sustain the work in the face of these extreme, these acute crises that have affected us all in different ways. And these guiding principles relate very closely to the ways in which we have also operated in our research partnership. So I know some of you are in the audience. And thank you for contributing to our knowledge and helping us to bring this work together. So thank you.
Thank you all so much, Zeena, Francine, and the entire research team. I'm so grateful for having had the chance to work with you over the past 3 years, and I'm so grateful to see where we have arrived right now. These findings are extremely relevant, and I'm hoping that they have allowed everyone watching today to take a moment and reflect and think about ways that this might apply to our own work. And we do invite everyone to engage with us in these reflections. Feel free to reach out to me, to Sonja, to Zeena, or Francine, and definitely urge everyone to check out the website and all the links that Sonja has shared. Any future dissemination events or outputs will also be shared on that website. So future publications or conference presentations or anything else. Thank you all again for your attendance, and more to come soon from eCubed.
Thank you, Nadeen. Thank you everyone for joining. The recording will also be shared on the INEE website if you'd like to reference it in the future or share it for other colleagues who couldn't join. Just a huge thanks again to Francine and Zeena and the rest of the research team, and to Dubai Cares and you, Nadeen, for championing this, this work. Hope you all have a nice afternoon, evening, wherever you are, and we appreciate you being with us today. Take care, everyone.